Good morning and welcome back to day one of NWR's Virtual Investor Conference, Series 11. My name is Max Don and I'll be your host for today. Up next this morning, we have Imricor Medical Systems. Imricor is a leading developer of innovative MRI-compatible medical devices, which can be used to carry out MRI-guided cardiac catheter ablation procedures. This morning, we have Imricor CEO Steve Wedan presenting. A reminder before I pass it over to Steve that you can submit questions live throughout the session via the Q&A function on Zoom, and we will endeavour to get to these questions at the end of the presentation. Steve, I'll now hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Max. Appreciate that. So in the time we have here, I've got a lot of slides, but I won't step through each one of them. I just want to touch on 5 or 6 of them that I think are important to give you a feel for what we do at Imricor, what the business opportunity is that we're presented with, and how we're going to succeed in fulfilling our potential. I should start by reiterating what Max said a moment ago. We make interventional devices for interventional procedures that are uniquely compatible with MRI, meaning that they can be used in a procedure where the patient is imaged with magnetic resonance imaging throughout the procedure, rather than by conventional X-ray means that have been used up until today. And so what we're doing at Imricor is we're moving interventional procedures, in particular cardiac ablation procedures, we're moving them from the conventional X-ray labs that they're used in today, where everybody plays. All of the consumable devices that from various manufacturers are all geared towards that interventional X-ray lab. And we're moving those procedures over to an iCMR lab. iCMR stands for Interventional Cardiac Magnetic Resonance. And this iCMR EP lab is a lab in which only Imricor makes devices, and only Imricor has the technology that allows us to make those devices. So what does this mean for everybody involved? Well, for the physicians and the patients and the hospitals, they get to do the same kinds of procedures that they do today with the same kinds of tools. It's just that they're MR compatible from Imricor, but now they can take advantage of MR imaging while they're doing the procedures. And for cardiac procedures, this is really important because the cardiac system, the heart, the great vessels, these are invisible to X-rays. So for the first time when you're doing these procedures, doctors can see the tissue that they're actually trying to work on, the heart that they're trying to cure. And as they more carefully address the heart to apply therapy, they can see the results of their therapy in a way that is impossible to do today. Today, when you treat somebody in a conventional EP lab, you can tell if their arrhythmia, the thing that you're trying to solve, if it's gone away during the procedure, but you can't tell if the therapy you delivered is durable, if it's going to last for once the patient goes home. Often the patient goes home and you didn't quite get the job done that you wanted to, and the therapy resolves in a way where the arrhythmia comes back. So it takes 2 or 3 procedures to get the kind of outcome that you want to get. With MRI, you can see that therapy. You can make sure that you did the job right the first time. That's been the promise of MR guidance for these types of procedures since the mid-90s when it was first contemplated. In addition, there's no radiation for the patient, and importantly, no radiation for the physician who stands in that X-ray field day after day after day. There's no lead gowns for any of the medical personnel. And the MRI gives the ability for the hospital to generate additional revenue throughout the day when they're not doing procedures, because it still houses a standard MRI diagnostic imaging system that can image anything on the patient from knees to hearts to brains. For Imricor, what it means is once we move a physician and his team from a conventional X-ray lab over to an iCMR EP lab, we capture 100% of the consumable revenue. There is no competition for Imricor in that iCMR lab. And there are no other EP procedures that can be performed except the ones that Imricor supports. So from a business standpoint, what that means is that if we look at each of these iCMR EP labs, the annual consumable device revenue per iCMR lab will grow over the years. We're starting with atrial flutter. That's the first type of arrhythmia that our devices have regulatory approval to treat. And with atrial flutter, I'll show you the math a little bit later. It's worth about $245,000 US per iCMR lab each year. This is in consumable device revenue. As we add in the future now, in the near future, ventricular tachycardia or VT indications to treat that arrhythmia, it just about doubles, actually a little bit more than doubles the revenue that we can create per iCMR lab in Europe. And further down the road, as we add atrial fibrillation or AFib, the number grows for each iCMR lab conservatively above $1 million per lab. And to put that all in context, there are about 1,000, actually over 1,000 labs in just Europe. I should say there are over 1,000 ablation centers, and each center often has more than one EP lab in Europe. And in the United States, there are over 1,100, conservatively, 1,100 ablation centers, each of those often with more than one EP lab. So it's a large market, and there's lots of opportunity for Imricor to break into this. If you look at us from a glancing standpoint, then it's a $6 billion worldwide market. We have two core products, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. And through the pandemic, while we launched right into the beginning of the pandemic, which is terrible timing, we still have signed 15 new sites throughout the pandemic. And the work we're doing right now those are the sites that are getting started doing procedures now as we start to move other sites through the process of our sales. We have a robust patent portfolio. We've got a great pipeline of new sites that are backed up that we are working through the sales process and on, if you can see on this slide. When you invest in Imricor, you're investing in a company that is founder-led. I founded this company myself in 2006 with some physicians from Johns Hopkins University. I put together here a management team that is the best I've worked with in all my 30 years of medical devices. And that is why we have done something that nobody else in the world has ever been able to yet do. And what I mean yet, I mean even to today. This has been true since we first made our first MR-compatible device. No one has ever been able to do this, and lots of people have tried. This is not so important. This is just the timeline you can look at how we got to where we are. And this is some market information that you can look at it in more detail. I think probably at a later time. I want to point out this is just the disposables, so the consumable revenue. This does not include the capital equipment portion of this market. But you can see it's a robust market, obviously. And it's growing quite well. This is another slide, a lot of information on here, but essentially it boils down to what I said before. In X-ray, the heart's invisible. In MRI, the heart is clearly visible, and all the advantages that come from that, from seeing what you're doing, seeing what you've done, procedure effectiveness, meaning be able to do the thing more quickly that you're trying to do. Our devices are similarly priced to devices that exist today, so the cost per procedure is the same for the hospital and the payer. We expect the procedure times to go down, and of course, the safety is improved when you remove all that radiation. This is the current product portfolio that we have. This is the set of tools that you need to do an atrial flutter ablation. It's an ablation catheter. Actually, we use 2 of them per procedure. And a dispersive electrode, which is where you collect the ablative energy. It's a patch that goes on the backside of the patient during the procedure. Those are our consumable products. Capital equipment is what's called an EP recorder system and stimulator. It's the thing that allows us to measure and display the electrical activity of the heart for this physician and pace the heart during the procedure. These are all important in the MR safety aspects of the device or of the procedure, meaning you can't have one of these without the other and still have an MR-compatible procedure. We have many key opinion leaders, and we have for a long time. At the Helios Heart Center, I'll just mention this one, Professor Gerhard Hendricks, past president of the European Heart Rhythm Association, principal investigator for our atrial flutter trial. A great partner of ours for over a decade, and the person who will be the PI for our ventricular tachycardia clinical trial later this year. We have historically, routinely attracted the best minds and the best physicians because what we're doing has been so wanted for so long. We've got a great patent portfolio, which I mentioned, and this is our business model for revenue. I only say that just stop here because there's one thing on this slide that we haven't talked about. We have the capital equipment sale, and we have the consumable sales, and we spoke about that. And not only do we sell, though, our own capital equipment, but we sell third-party equipment as well. screens that go in the MR room, headsets that allow doctors to communicate in and out of the room, 12-lead ECG system, on and on. And these are by putting together third-party agreements that allow us to sell this capital equipment, we can provide to the hospital a one-stop shop for all the equipment they need to outfit their new iCMR lab. We have some other revenue and IP licensing, which we've done years ago in particular. We're not doing that actively right now, but we are actively doing contract research with the National Institutes of Health here in the United States to help develop new devices beyond ablation that are guided by MRI. And this is sort of where I want to focus. This is a big ship we're changing. We're trying to move a whole field from X-ray, conventional X-ray EP labs into these iCMR EP labs. And while there's a lot of demand to do that, there's some purposeful things that we have to do to make sure that we're a successful business. In the short term, we need to grow the number of iCMR sites. We're at 15 now. We want to get to many more than that in the very near future. And the key driver to doing that is that the folks who are doing procedures now in our existing and active iCMR sites are presenting on these procedures, they're publishing on their experiences. And this is something that's been missing since the pandemic, because atrial flutter ablations, the ones our initial indications allow us to do, are the kind of procedures that were prohibited during the pandemic. They were doing VT and AF procedures, but we don't have indications for those yet. So it was just a bad situation during the pandemic. But now, as they're getting started and ramping up their volume in our iCMR labs, we need them talking about it and spreading the word. We need to grow our company's footprint across different geographies, different countries, because that creates the kind of competitive pressures and tensions between hospitals that help us expand our footprint. What I mean by that is a great example is in the Netherlands. In the early days of the pandemic, we started at the Haga Teaching Hospital in The Hague, and we started at the Amsterdam University Medical Center. And as soon as we did that and announced it, Maastricht University Medical Center called us up and said, hey, wait, we think we're the leaders in EP here in the Netherlands. And so if these guys are doing that, we need to be doing it too. That's exactly the reason why it's important for us to get into as many new countries as we can and grow that competition. We need to show progress towards VT. People don't want to see that this is an atrial flutter solution. They want to see that this is atrial flutter starting. We're going to do our atrial flutter ablations in here, sure, but what we really want to do are VT ablations and AFib ablations. And so we need to show people that we're making that progress. And as we do that, as we start clinical trials, or even as we move through preclinical work and into submitting for clinical trials, this is going to be a great catalyst for increasing the number of sites that are adopting now. We're engaging with new physicians. We're engaging with our MRI partners. We have great partnerships with Siemens and with Philips. We're growing a partnership with GE right now as well. And this helps drive adoption as we work with those sales teams and those marketing teams from the MRI vendors to help grow the field. And we're expanding our approvals beyond just Europe to expand sites into the United States, into Australia, into New Zealand. In the midterm, that's when we need to do this thing I was mentioning before about growing into VT. We need to grow the number of iCMR procedures that we can do, the different types that they can do in the iCMR lab. And so we needed to develop new consumable devices to allow us to perform a VT procedure. Well, that's done. We needed to partner with third parties to deliver auxiliary equipment that's needed for these VT procedures. For instance, 12-lead ECG and defibrillation. That's done. And that's something we've had to plan ahead years and years in advance. To move this big ship, it needs careful planning, right? And so we've been working toward these things for many years, and now they're all ready for the VT trial. And that's the next step, is demonstrating the clinical effectiveness of our devices for ventricular tachycardia through clinical trials, and then ultimately receiving approval. I want to say real quick, when you look at demonstrating clinical effectiveness, that can seem like a risky thing. So I want to remind everyone that we're not inventing new interventional procedures. Our ablation catheter looks, feels, functions just like existing catheters that are out there today. It's just that it's MRI compatible. And we already know that cardiac ablation of ventricular tachycardia is something that works if it can be done properly during the procedure. So we're not studying if VT works. We're just studying if our catheter can ablate like other catheters can, if it can sense like other catheters can. And essentially, we've already shown those same functionalities in our atrial flutter trials and our atrial flutter commercialization. So it's just a matter of working the process now from here up. if we look beyond that, the short and midterm to how this whole thing scales, we've got a couple of different value propositions. There's our current value proposition of where we are now. There's approximately 1,000 sites in Europe where we have approval. About 70 procedures happen per site per year for atrial flutter, and we make $3,500 per procedure. So that's about $245,000 per iCMR lab. That's the number that I showed you earlier as well. If we capture just 5% of these sites, less than 50, that provides us $12 million of annual renewable revenue. And it's interesting to point out that our early adopting labs, they're typically on the higher end of that average. When we say there's 70 on average, that's over all 1,000 of them. The first ones that we're starting with are the heavy hitters. They're the big sites, they're the high volume sites, and they often do many, many more procedures. So it's likely we won't need even those 50 sites to get to that $12 million mark. Towards the end of 2023, this is when we change a bit. Now we're growing our business through ventricular tachycardia ablations, and that is expected to double our EU revenue. Our early adopters, these big sites that we're talking to, the key opinion leaders, they're the ones that do many, many of these VT ablations as well. There's a higher ASP for our devices. We sell more devices into a VT procedure. There's higher reimbursement for the hospital for a VT procedure, and this is a difficult conventional ablation where we're going to add significant value with MRI. So we expect this to drive a significant increase in site adoption as doctors are eagerly awaiting VT inside the MRI. And this trial, I think I mentioned earlier, is starting this year, and we expect by the end of 2023, maybe the beginning of 2024, that those indications will come through and we'll be rolling with VT. In 2024, this is when we expect our US FDA approval as well, the end of 23, moving into 2024. There will be growing our installed base again. So it's not like in Europe where once we get VT, every lab that we already have established can start doing those procedures. It'll be a restart of growth here in the United States, but it more than doubles the number of ablation sites that we have available to us, the market. And we'll have all this traction from Europe to drive awareness in the United States. So it'll be a much different situation. There's higher reimbursement here in the United States than there is compared to Europe as well. And so it's expected that the US revenue opportunity is about 2 times the revenue opportunity in Europe. And where we are right today is that our IDE is under review, and we're working with the FDA to get approval of that IDE. That stands for Investigational Device Exemption, and that's the approval we need to commence a clinical trial here in the United States. And then as we look beyond that, 2025, 2026, this is where we'll continue to grow through atrial fibrillation ablations, which use the same consumable products that we've already now developed for VT. It's the largest volume of procedures of all the types of procedures that folks ablate for. And that's where we'll get access to the full market potential of $6 billion, which is today and will be larger at that time. A great question is, Steve, why VT first and not AFib if there's more AFib patients? It's pretty straightforward. The AFib trial takes longer, so that would push all of these timelines out. And there's a lot of competition in AFib. And VT has a really strong need. It's a growing need. There's more VT patients growing each year. And it's a very difficult procedure conventionally. So MR adds so much value so quickly with little competition and a fast trial. We felt like this was the next complex indication we should move toward. The last thing I want to point out with respect to the business is this, that if it wasn't clear, I want to make sure it is, that every stakeholder involved in this is positively motivated to move towards MRI. The patient gets a better procedure. The patient gets no radiation. The doctor gets to provide a better procedure and does not need to stand in that radiation field day after day, all day long. The payer, the insurance company or the government that's paying for the procedure, they have the opportunity to pay about the same price per procedure that they pay conventionally. But if we can procure the patient in one procedure rather than 2 or 3, then the overall cost per patient goes way down. And the hospital can attract additional patients. They get to eliminate the radiation and the risks and liabilities associated with that. They have a new MRI system that when they're not doing EP procedures, they can bill and generate revenue in that footprint by doing diagnostic MR imaging, and then the similar cost procedure, so that there's no big upfront cost for them to do that. So I have one last slide. This is just what our focus is on for this particular year. We are focused on essentially relaunching out of COVID. We still felt the effects of COVID in January and February, but March, we're starting to hit our stride and feel traction. Things are getting back to normal in the field, which is really, really refreshing. So we expect a steady relaunch of site expansion throughout 2022. We're activating sites that signed during the pandemic but couldn't start doing procedures until now. We did that last week. We started procedures at Helios Berlin Buch. We're going to start procedures next week in Athens at one of our newest sites. We installed and trained them last week. So we'll see this happening as we roll forward. And once we get them up and running, then we want to increase the utilization to the max possible at each one of these sites. We're going to continue advancing our strategy around clinical trials for VT, progressing our approvals in the United States, progressing other devices. The one I mentioned to you earlier, we got a grant or contract from the National Institutes of Health to develop new devices. One of those devices is an MRI-compatible biopsy system. It allows you to take a biopsy of the inside of the heart while using MRI to actually see where you're trying to take that biopsy from. So that's a pretty exciting new procedure and products for down the road. And the third thing is we'll continue progressing our products that we've built now and are in the final stages of testing for VT. Those will be in the VT trial, and then they'll be submitted for CE mark certification while the trial is going on. The second generation ablation catheter is a new generation, lower cost, better performance catheter than the one we currently have on the market. And that one will come with approval after the trial is complete because it will have those VT indications. But other things like the steerable sheath and transeptal needle that are used to cross from one side of the heart to the other, these are devices that can go through the CE mark process in parallel with our clinical trial. I think that's what I have for today. Yes, it is. So I guess this is probably a good time to ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And it's refreshing to hear that COVID's finally subsiding. Just a reminder to everyone on the call that you can submit questions via the Q&A function. First question up is 15 labs currently signed this year. What is it currently signed? What is a realistic number to be signed in the next 12 months?
Yeah, it's so hard for us to predict. I would love to have guidance out on what we expect. I mean, of course we have a plan and we see the sites in that timeline, but because we've been mired in this COVID for the past couple of years, we don't have a good historical feel for exactly how long it's going to take, or at least on average, to move a site through. What I can say is we're going to get one in the very, very near future again. We have two that we talked about in our quarterly update that are under construction, and those will be operational towards the end of the year. And we have many more in the pipeline that will start moving through. It's I would say let's expect reasonable growth along these lines, but it's hard for me to put a number out at this time.
Thanks. Another one here on M&A. When you think of M&A and a logical acquirer of Imricor, how do you think about this?
Well, historically, there have been a couple of different, we were a private company, obviously, for over a decade. And there are a couple of different types of companies that were interested in us. Conventional ablation companies like Medtronic, Johnson & Johnson, Abbott, Boston Scientific, but also MRI companies that have an interest in moving into procedures and the renewable revenue that you get associated with not just selling the capital equipment of the MRI, but also the disposables that go into those procedures. We're not actively in discussions with anybody, nor are we really pursuing that. We're trying to change standard of care, and we are now unshackled by COVID. And so I'm really excited about us just establishing ourselves as a real dominant power in medical devices.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve, and thanks for your time this morning.